In the spring of 1941, the geopolitical balance in the Balkans shifted decisively as the Axis powers moved to dismantle the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. The April invasion, conducted jointly by Germany, Italy, and their allies, brought an end to the monarchy's short-lived attempt at neutrality. The campaign was swift. Beginning on April 6th, German armored columns advanced from Austria, Bulgaria, and Romania, supported by Italian forces from Albania and airstrikes from the Luftwaffe. Within 11 days, Belgrade had fallen, and by April 17th, Yugoslavia formally capitulated. The victors divided the territory according to their strategic priorities. Germany took control of key industrial and transport hubs in Serbia. Hungary occupied parts of Vojvodina, Bulgaria annexed much of Macedonia, and Italy extended its influence along the Adriatic coast and into Montenegro. For Fascist Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, Montenegro represented both a historical claim and a strategic opportunity. The territory had been under Italian military influence during the First World War, and its position on the Adriatic gave it naval value. The Italian High Command sought to transform Montenegro into a nominally independent state, aligned with Rome's interests, providing a buffer between Italian-occupied Albania and the rest of the Balkan interior. This vision fit into Mussolini's broader ambition for a Mare Nostrum, an Italian-dominated Mediterranean, and into the fascist narrative of reviving Roman imperial heritage. Montenegro's internal situation in 1941 was complex. The population, estimated at around 4,000, was predominantly Orthodox Christian, with smaller Muslim and Albanian communities. A significant number of Montenegrins identified with the pan-Serb idea and retained loyalty to the defunct Yugoslav monarchy. At the same time, there existed a tradition of local autonomy and clan-based governance, which had survived Ottoman rule and influenced political behavior in the interwar years. The economic base was modest. Agriculture, livestock, and small-scale trade dominated, with limited infrastructure connecting the rugged mountainous interior to coastal towns such as Kotor and Bar. Intelligence assessments from Italian sources in early 1941 suggested that direct annexation would be politically costly, risking armed resistance. Instead, Rome opted for an indirect approach, creating a puppet regime that would formally declare independence while remaining dependent on Italian military protection and economic aid. The plan involved mobilizing local collaborators, particularly among elites willing to accept Italian patronage in exchange for positions of authority. This approach mirrored Italian strategies in other occupied territories, including the Ionian Islands and parts of Dalmatia, where nominal self-governments masked direct control. Internationally, the decision to establish an independent state of Montenegro was shaped by Italy's relationship with its German ally. Berlin's primary interest in the region was strategic stability, ensuring that the southern flank remained secure, while Wehrmacht operations focused on Greece and, soon after, the Soviet Union. Allowing Italy to manage Montenegro fit this division of responsibilities. However, German intelligence officers expressed skepticism about the viability of such a state, noting the strength of pro-Yugoslav sentiment and the potential for communist partisan activity. Public sentiment within Montenegro, in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, was marked by uncertainty. The sudden collapse of Yugoslav authority created a political vacuum. Some local leaders viewed the Italian offer of nominal independence as a means to preserve order and avoid direct military occupation. Others saw it as a betrayal of national unity and an unacceptable collaboration with a foreign occupier. In rural areas, clan loyalties and family networks played a larger role in shaping initial reactions than formal political ideology. Still, the memory of earlier struggles for independence, particularly against Ottoman rule, contributed to a latent readiness for resistance. By late June 1941, Italian administrative preparations were underway. The puppet state's official proclamation was scheduled for mid-July, coinciding with the appointment of a provisional government composed of figures sympathetic to Italian interests. Plans included the adoption of a national flag, the establishment of a militia under Italian oversight, and the integration of Montenegro into the Italian economic sphere through trade agreements favoring Rome. The regime's propaganda emphasized historical ties between Montenegro and Italy, invoking cultural exchanges from the medieval period and framing the new state as part of a Latin Slavic alliance. In parallel, Rome explored the possibility of linking Montenegro more closely with Albania, which had been under Italian control since 1939. This concept included discussions about offering the Montenegrin crown to King Zog IV of Albania, then in exile, as a symbolic gesture of unity under a shared monarchy. While this proposal never materialized, it reflected the fluid and experimental nature of Italian policy in the region during the early months of occupation. Despite these preparations, Italian authorities remained aware of the precariousness of their position. Reports from military intelligence indicated growing activity by anti-Axis networks, including both royalist Chetniks and communist groups aligned with the Yugoslav Partisans. The rugged terrain, combined with widespread civilian familiarity with arms, created conditions favorable to insurgency. These warnings would soon prove prescient, as the July 13th uprising erupted within days of the puppet state's formal announcement, a development that would challenge the very foundation of Italy's strategy in Montenegro. The formal proclamation of the Independent State of Montenegro took place on 12th of July, 1941 in Cetinje, the historical capital. Italian authorities staged the event as a ceremonial affirmation of Montenegrin sovereignty, though the organization, security arrangements, and speech drafts all originated from the Italian civil and military administration. General Alessandro Pierzio Biroli, the Italian governor for Montenegro, oversaw the proceedings. The provisional government was headed by Sekula Drljevic, a politician who had previously advocated for Montenegrin distinctiveness within the Yugoslav framework, and who now aligned himself with the Italian project. The cabinet included several figures with political or military experience, some motivated by opportunism, others by the belief that Italian sponsorship could protect the territory from harsher forms of occupation. The Italian plan depended on presenting the state as a continuation of the Montenegrin kingdom that had existed prior to the Balkan Wars and the formation of Yugoslavia. Propaganda emphasized the restoration of an independent national identity suppressed since 1918, portraying the new regime as a rebirth rather than a creation of the occupiers. Flags bearing the Montenegrin coat of arms were distributed, and public buildings displayed bilingual signage in Montenegrin and Italian. At the same time, Italian carabinieri and army units remained stationed throughout major towns, controlling movement and enforcing decrees. Public reaction diverged sharply from the official narrative. In urban centers such as Cetinje, Podgorica, and Nikšić, the proclamation was met with guarded silence or discreet displays of dissent. In rural areas, especially in the northern and central highlands, the announcement galvanized opposition. Many communities considered the declaration illegitimate, viewing it as an imposition orchestrated by foreign powers. Both royalist and communist elements began mobilizing, albeit with differing visions for the future. The Chetniks sought the restoration of the Yugoslav monarchy and the preservation of Serbian-Montenegrin unity, while the communists aimed for a socialist federation after the war. Despite their ideological differences, in the summer of 1941, these groups shared an immediate objective: resisting the puppet government and its Italian sponsors. Italian intelligence reports from the first week after the proclamation recorded an increase in clandestine meetings, weapons stockpiling, and the spread of anti-occupation leaflets. The rugged geography of Montenegro, with its steep mountains and dense forests, provided ideal conditions for organizing resistance beyond the reach of Italian patrols. Small armed groups began to form, often led by individuals with military experience from the Royal Yugoslav Army. In several villages, local assemblies openly refused to recognize the authority of the new government. The economic situation further undermined Italian efforts. The country's agrarian economy was already strained by wartime disruptions to trade and transport. Italian requisitioning of food, livestock, and other supplies for military use aggravated shortages, creating resentment among farmers. Coastal trade with Italian ports brought limited consumer goods, but these were distributed unevenly and often prioritized for officials and collaborators. Inflation and scarcity weakened the regime's claim to be restoring stability. Politically, the Italians attempted to broaden the government's legitimacy by engaging with Muslim and Albanian minority leaders, offering assurances of religious freedom and local administrative roles. However, these efforts yielded mixed results. While some notables accepted positions, others remained cautious, wary of being associated with an unpopular regime whose survival depended on foreign troops. The unfulfilled proposal to invite King Zog the Frown of Albania as a unifying monarch lingered in the background, occasionally mentioned in propaganda, but never implemented, as Rome could not secure sufficient local support for the idea. By early July, as preparations for the proclamation reached their final stage, underground resistance networks had already begun coordinating for a broader action. Communist cadres, drawing on the structure of the Yugoslav Communist Party, disseminated calls for a mass uprising to coincide with the first days of the puppet state's existence. Royalist groups, though less centralized, also discussed armed demonstrations. The convergence of these plans would lead directly to the events of 13th July, when the proclamation intended to symbolize stability instead became the trigger for a nationwide rebellion. On 13th July 1941, the situation in Montenegro shifted abruptly from ceremonial politics to armed conflict. The uprising, which had been planned in various forms by both communist and royalist factions, unfolded across multiple districts almost simultaneously. In the early hours of the day, coordinated attacks targeted Italian garrisons, communication lines, and administrative offices. The choice of date, the day after the proclamation of the independent state, was deliberate, intended to signal complete rejection of the new regime before it could consolidate power. The communist faction, under the direction of the Regional Committee of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia for Montenegro, had spent weeks preparing. Weapons were collected from hidden caches left by the disbanded Royal Yugoslav Army, as well as from deserters and sympathetic gendarmes. Couriers carried messages through the mountainous terrain, linking villages into operational clusters. The communists sought to frame the uprising as part of a broader struggle against the Axis, aligning it with calls from the Comintern for resistance in occupied Europe. At the same time, they worked to present themselves as leaders of a multi-ethnic, anti-fascist movement, welcoming participation from any political background. Royalist Chetnik elements, though less ideologically cohesive, joined in the fighting in several areas. Some local commanders entered into tactical cooperation with communist units, agreeing to focus on driving out Italian forces before addressing political differences. In regions such as the Moracha and Lim River valleys, Chetnik-led detachments attacked Italian convoys and roadblocks, disrupting supply routes between garrisons. While communist units often emphasized sabotage and mass mobilization, royalist groups concentrated on ambushes and the defense of strategic mountain passes. Italian military records from mid-July indicate that approximately 3,000 insurgents participated in the first phase of the uprising, confronting a garrison of around 14,000 Italian troops stationed in Montenegro at the time. These troops included the 19th Infantry Division Venetia, the 18th Infantry Division Messina, and various carabinieri units, supported by coastal detachments from the Italian Navy. The rebels' numerical advantage in the initial days, combined with their familiarity with the terrain, enabled them to seize control of many rural areas and small towns. By the 15th of July, insurgents held Nikšić, Kolašin, and a number of mountain villages, effectively isolating Italian outposts in the interior. Civilian involvement was significant. In many communities, entire families contributed to the uprising. Men joined combat units. Women provided food, shelter, and intelligence, and young people served as messengers. The rebellion disrupted the functioning of the puppet government almost immediately. Ministers and officials in Sektinje found themselves cut off from much of the countryside, reliant on Italian escorts to move between administrative centers. Pro-regime newspapers and radio broadcasts were interrupted, and the flow of goods from coastal ports to the interior stalled. Italian command responded by declaring martial law and ordering reinforcements from neighboring Albania and Dalmatia. General Baroli requested air support to target rebel concentrations and disrupt their supply lines. The Regia Aeronautica conducted reconnaissance flights and occasional bombing raids on suspected insurgent positions, though the dispersed nature of the uprising made such operations less effective. Italian forces also began constructing fortified positions around key towns, focusing on protecting transportation corridors and the coastal strip. The uprising was not uniform in intensity. While large-scale engagements occurred in the central and northern mountains, some coastal areas remained under firm Italian control, partly due to heavier troop concentrations and more accessible supply lines. In certain Muslim-majority towns, local leaders hesitated to join the rebellion, fearing reprisals or political instability. This uneven participation later influenced the dynamics of the conflict, as Italian authorities sought to exploit divisions between different communities. Within the first week, the uprising achieved a level of territorial control unusual for early resistance movements in occupied Europe. Insurgents established provisional local administrations in some areas, often reviving pre-war municipal structures or creating ad hoc councils to coordinate defense and logistics. However, coordination between communist and royalist elements remained fragile. Disagreements over political objectives, particularly the future status of Montenegro and its relationship to a restored Yugoslavia, surfaced even as the fighting continued. The July 13th uprising quickly gained attention beyond Montenegro. Axis intelligence services in neighboring territories reported increased partisan activity, raising concerns that the rebellion might inspire similar movements in other occupied Balkan regions. The German military attaché in Zagreb noted that the scale of the uprising was unexpected, given the short time since the Italian occupation, and recommended closer German monitoring of the situation despite it being under Italian jurisdiction. By late July, the initial momentum of the uprising began to face challenges. Italian reinforcements were arriving, better armed and organized than the garrison troops initially caught off guard. The insurgents, while numerous, faced shortages of ammunition, medical supplies, and secure communication lines. The rugged terrain that had favored their early successes also made sustained coordination difficult. Nevertheless, the rebellion had already achieved its immediate political goal. It had demonstrated, both to the local population and to the Axis powers, that the puppet state lacked broad legitimacy and could not function without heavy military backing. By early August 1941, the Italian High Command initiated a coordinated counteroffensive to suppress the uprising and reassert control over Montenegro. General Pirzio Biroli reorganized available forces into mobile columns capable of rapid deployment in the mountainous interior. Reinforcements from Albania included elements of the 48th Infantry Division, Taro, as well as additional Carabinieri and Blackshirt militia units. Italian troop strength in Montenegro rose to approximately 7,000 men, giving them a decisive numerical advantage over the insurgents, whose numbers had declined due to casualties, desertions, and the seasonal return of fighters to agricultural work. The counteroffensive was planned in phases. The first objective was to secure main transportation routes, particularly the Podgorica-Nikšić corridor and the coastal roads linking Kotor, Bar, and Ulcinj. Control of these arteries allowed the Italians to ensure the movement of troops, supplies, and artillery. Armored cars and light tanks, though limited in their effectiveness on narrow mountain roads, provided firepower in assaults on fortified villages. Italian engineers rebuilt destroyed bridges and cleared roadblocks while under the protection of infantry patrols. The second phase focused on isolating and dismantling insurgent strongholds. The Italians used intelligence from captured rebels and informants to identify supply depots, meeting points, and radio stations. Air reconnaissance played a role in mapping insurgent movement, while the Regia Aeronautica conducted targeted bombing raids on suspected headquarters in the Durmitor and Komovi ranges. In several cases, Italian forces surrounded mountain villages, offering amnesty to those who surrendered weapons, but carrying out arrests and deportations when resistance persisted. Harsh reprisals became a central feature of the campaign. Villages accused of sheltering partisans faced collective punishments, including the burning of homes, confiscation of livestock, and internment of inhabitants in camps. Italian records from August and September document the detention of over 1,000 civilians, many of whom were transported to camps in Albania or southern Italy. Such measures aimed to cut the insurgents off from their civilian support base, but they also deepened hostility toward the occupation and eroded the influence of the puppet government, which had little authority over military operations. The rebels attempted to maintain their positions through a combination of defensive engagements and strategic withdrawals. Communist-led units reorganized into smaller, more mobile formations, operating in platoon or company strength rather than large assemblies. These groups focused on ambushes, mining roads, and attacking isolated patrols to slow Italian advances. Royalist forces, particularly in the Eastern Highlands, concentrated on defending their home regions, avoiding pitched battles where Italian firepower could be brought to bear. Tensions between communist and royalist factions began to sharpen during this period. Initial cooperation during the uprising had been based on shared opposition to the puppet regime, but strategic and ideological differences soon became more pronounced. Disputes arose over the allocation of captured weapons, the conduct of reprisals against suspected collaborators, and the political messaging of the resistance. Communist commanders sought to expand the struggle into a broader anti-fascist war, aligned with the Yugoslav partisan movement, while many Chetnik leaders prioritized the defense of Serb and Montenegrin communities, and the eventual restoration of the pre-war monarchy. Italian propaganda exploited these divisions. State-controlled newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed the insurgents as fragmented and disorganized, claiming that many had already laid down their arms. The regime in Cetinje attempted to re-establish administrative control by appointing loyalist municipal councils and reopening schools under Italian supervision. Collaborators were promised economic incentives, such as access to imported goods and protection from requisitions, but the climate of insecurity made these offers less effective. By September 1941, the Italian counteroffensive had retaken most of the territory lost during the uprising's first phase. Nikšić, Kolašin, and Pljevlja were once again under Italian control, and major road networks were operational. However, the countryside remained unstable. Rebel groups continued to operate in the mountains, launching intermittent raids and maintaining links to resistance movements in neighboring Serbia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina. The puppet government's authority was still largely symbolic outside of major towns. The failure to fully eliminate the resistance led the Italian command to adopt a policy of sustained military presence combined with selective political concessions. Garrisons were reinforced in key areas, while certain local leaders were given limited autonomy in civil matters in exchange for cooperation. These measures reduced large-scale confrontations, but entrenched a state of low-intensity conflict that would persist for the remainder of the war. The July uprising had been contained militarily, but it had permanently undermined the credibility of the independent state of Montenegro, ensuring that it remained dependent on continuous Italian military support for survival. The suppression of the July uprising left Montenegro under heavy military occupation, with the puppet government functioning largely as an administrative extension of Italian policy. By autumn 1941, Italian forces maintained permanent garrisons in all major towns, supported by smaller posts in rural areas and along key mountain passes. Checkpoints restricted movement between regions, and travel often required special permits issued by military authorities. The Italian command divided the territory into military districts, each overseen by an officer with authority over both civil and security matters, effectively sidelining the nominal ministers in Cetinje. Economically, the occupation deepened wartime hardships. Requisitioning of agricultural produce for the Italian army remained systematic, with quotas imposed on villages regardless of harvest yields. This policy, combined with the loss of livestock during summer reprisals, created acute shortages in many communities. The Italians sought to integrate Montenegro into their Adriatic supply network, using ports like Bar and Kotor to import limited quantities of manufactured goods and foodstuffs from Italy. These imports, however, were distributed primarily to the military, collaborators, and urban centers under firm control, leaving much of the countryside dependent on subsistence farming and informal barter systems. The puppet regime attempted to project normalcy through symbolic acts. Official ceremonies marked national holidays and historical anniversaries, with speeches emphasizing the rebirth of Montenegrin independence under Italian protection. Cultural programs promoted links between Montenegrin and Italian history, highlighting medieval maritime connections and religious ties through the Catholic Church. The government also reintroduced a separate Montenegrin currency pegged to the Italian lira, aiming to signal sovereignty while facilitating economic dependence on Rome. Yet these gestures found little resonance among a population that associated them with occupation and repression. Politically, the regime faced mounting challenges in balancing Italian directives with the realities on the ground. While some local notables cooperated to secure limited benefits for their communities, many viewed open collaboration as dangerous given the persistent presence of armed resistance. In certain areas, municipal councils operated in a dual system, publicly acknowledging Chetniks' authority, while discreetly negotiating with insurgent commanders to avoid reprisals. This duality reflected the broader instability of the occupation. Neither side could claim total control, and loyalties often shifted according to immediate circumstances. Italian intelligence recognized that suppressing the uprising had not eliminated the resistance network. Communist-led partisan units, though reduced in number, established permanent bases in remote mountain regions, such as Durmitor and Bielasica. From these positions, they launched raids on Italian supply convoys, sabotaged rail lines, and targeted pro-regime officials. The royalist Chetnik detachments, often based in the eastern highlands, maintained control over certain villages and avoided direct confrontation with Italian forces when possible, focusing instead on consolidating influence among the local Serb population. While occasional cooperation between partisans and Chetniks still occurred against common targets, ideological and strategic rifts were widening. In late 1941, the conflict in Montenegro became increasingly intertwined with developments across the wider Yugoslav theater. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June had intensified communist resistance activity throughout the Balkans, and the Yugoslav partisan movement under Josip Broz. Tito sought to unify regional uprisings into a coordinated front. Montenegrin partisan leaders established communication channels with partisan headquarters in western Serbia, enabling the transfer of instructions, political directives, and sometimes personnel. Italian authorities responded by tightening border security, particularly along routes connecting Montenegro to Serbia and Bosnia, in an effort to prevent cross-border coordination. The occupation also began to see the emergence of Italian-sponsored auxiliary forces. These units, recruited locally, were tasked with guard duties, anti-smuggling patrols, and occasional counterinsurgency operations. Recruitment was driven by a combination of incentives, regular pay, protection for families, and the avoidance of requisition quotas, and coercion with threats of arrest or property seizure for refusal. While these auxiliaries provided the Italians with additional manpower, they also became targets for insurgent reprisals, which further discouraged recruitment in some regions. By the end of the year, Italian command acknowledged in internal reports that the Independent State of Montenegro existed in name but not in substance. Civil institutions operated under military supervision, the economy was subordinated to Italian logistical needs, and the security situation remained volatile. While open, large-scale rebellion had been crushed, the persistence of armed resistance, combined with the deep unpopularity of the puppet regime, ensured that stability was fragile. The Italians faced the prospect of a prolonged and costly occupation, with little indication that political consolidation was achievable under existing conditions. The winter of 1941-1942 brought a temporary lull in large-scale operations, but did not diminish the underlying instability in Montenegro. Italian forces shifted from major offensives to a strategy of maintaining constant pressure on resistance networks through patrols, intelligence gathering, and selective raids. The mountainous terrain, combined with severe weather conditions, limited mobility for both sides. Heavy snow blocked some passes, isolating garrisons and rebel strongholds alike. In this period, control over individual valleys and villages often depended on who could physically reach them through winter routes. For the puppet government in Cetinje, winter was a period of administrative consolidation under Italian supervision. Ministries attempted to resume basic services such as postal delivery, public schooling, and municipal record-keeping, but the effectiveness of these efforts varied sharply by region. In areas near major garrisons, Podgorica, Nikšić, Cetinje, Italian security allowed for a semblance of regular governance. In more remote districts, local authorities functioned sporadically, or not at all, with insurgents exerting de facto control after dark. The regime relied on Italian military escorts to move officials between towns, underscoring its dependence on foreign protection. Economic life remained constrained by wartime shortages. Agricultural production in 1941 had been disrupted, not only by fighting, but also by the requisitioning policies that stripped many communities of surplus grain and livestock. Winter markets in urban centers operated under rationing systems, with goods priced in the Montenegrin perper, but calculated according to the Italian lira's exchange rate. Black market activity expanded, supplying scarce items such as salt, sugar, and textiles. Italian authorities tolerated some of this trade when it benefited their garrisons, but cracked down on transactions suspected of aiding the resistance. The resistance adapted to winter conditions by focusing on consolidation and reorganization. Partisan units, operating in small mobile detachments, maintained contact with their bases in Serbia and Bosnia. They used the period to train new recruits, repair weapons, and establish supply caches for the coming spring. The Chetnik forces also regrouped, often closer to their home communities, and began formalizing command structures. This was the period when ideological divergence between the two movements became increasingly evident. The Partisans emphasized preparations for an expanded, coordinated anti-Axis struggle across Yugoslavia, while the Chetniks leaned towards selective engagement, avoiding direct clashes with Italian troops when not strategically necessary. Italian intelligence services worked actively to deepen the rift between the factions. Agents spread rumors of communist reprisals against civilians and sought to portray the Chetniks as potential allies in maintaining order. In some districts, informal arrangements emerged in which Chetnik commanders agreed not to attack Italian positions in exchange for freedom of movement in their areas. These arrangements were rarely formalized, but reflected a pragmatic calculation by both sides. For the Italians, it allowed concentration of resources against the partisans. For the Chetniks, it preserved manpower and avoided destructive reprisals. The puppet regime sought to legitimize itself through limited social programs and symbolic outreach. Italian cultural missions organized public events in larger towns, featuring exhibitions, concerts, and lectures on shared Latin Slav heritage. Local newspapers carried articles praising Italy's role in preserving Montenegrin autonomy. Educational reforms introduced Italian language instruction in schools, particularly in coastal areas, alongside Montenegrin history, presented from a pro-regime perspective. While these initiatives reached urban populations, they had minimal impact in rural areas, where schools often remained closed due to security concerns or lack of resources. The winter months also saw continued discussion in Italian political circles about the idea of uniting Montenegro with Albania under a single monarch, possibly King Zog. Proponents argued that such a move could simplify administration and create a larger political unit under Italian influence. Opponents, including some in the military, warned that it would alienate segments of the Montenegrin elite and inflame nationalist sentiment. In the end, the plan remained on paper, with Rome prioritizing short-term stability over constitutional experiment. By early 1942, Italian command assessed that, while open rebellion had been contained, Montenegro was far from pacified. The reduction of combat operations in winter had not diminished the resistance's capacity to act once conditions improved. Reports from garrison commanders consistently noted that partisan activity resumed as soon as snow began to melt, suggesting that the insurgency was enduring rather than episodic. The Italian strategy going into the spring would focus on preemptive strikes against suspected rebel concentrations, continued cultivation of local auxiliaries, and the maintenance of a strong garrison presence in all strategic centers. The puppet state's survival remained entirely dependent on this military framework, with its political institutions functioning only within the narrow limits allowed by occupation forces. With the arrival of spring 1942, the fragile balance in Montenegro once again shifted toward open confrontation. Melting snow reopened the mountain passes, allowing both Italian forces and resistance units greater mobility. Italian command, aware that the previous year's July uprising had been organized in part during the warmer months, aimed to disrupt any early preparations for renewed large-scale rebellion. This meant a combination of preemptive operations, intelligence sweeps, and targeted raids against suspected partisan bases before they could regain full operational strength. Italian troop deployments in spring totaled roughly 7,000 men, including infantry from the Venezia, Messina, and Taro divisions, coastal defense units, carabinieri, and black shirt militia. Mobile columns, supported by artillery and occasional air reconnaissance, were tasked with clearing the central highlands and severing the supply lines of insurgent forces. Patrols became more frequent in the Durmitor, Sinjajevina, and Byalasisa ranges, areas where partisans had established winter camps. The Italians also fortified garrisons in key market towns such as Nikšić, Kolashin, and Andrijevica, ensuring they could serve as logistical hubs for rapid response operations. The resistance movements responded with differing strategies. The partisans, following directives from the supreme headquarters of the Yugoslav partisan movement, intensified their emphasis on coordinated actions with neighboring regions. They staged sabotage operations against road and rail infrastructure, targeting bridges and culverts vital to Italian supply chains. Mines were laid on mountain roads, forcing Italian convoys to travel with engineering escorts. The Chetniks, while continuing to engage in limited anti-Italian operations, increasingly concentrated on consolidating their influence in areas with majority Serb and Montenegrin populations. In certain districts, they reached informal non-aggression understandings with Italian commanders, focusing their efforts on countering the communist partisans rather than the occupation itself. This divergence deepened the political split within the resistance. Armed clashes between partisan and Chetnik units began to occur more frequently, particularly in the Maraca River Valley and in parts of northern Montenegro. These encounters often involved disputes over control of villages, recruitment of local fighters, or the appropriation of supplies. For the Italians, this fragmentation was an exploitable advantage. Intelligence reports encouraged Rome to continue policies that indirectly fostered interfactional hostility, thereby reducing unified pressure on occupation forces. The puppet government in Cetinje attempted to capitalize on this division by portraying itself as a stabilizing authority. Public statements emphasized the need to end fratricidal conflict and pledged that the regime, under Italian protection, would safeguard communities from both foreign ideologies and destructive insurgent bands. Administrative initiatives included the reopening of some rural schools, distribution of limited agricultural aid, and modest infrastructure repairs, projects designed to demonstrate the benefits of cooperating with the state. Nonetheless, the regime's credibility remained minimal, as most of these initiatives were possible only in areas under tight Italian military control. Economically, spring brought modest relief with the resumption of coastal trade routes. Italian supply ships transported goods from Bari and Brindisi to the ports of Kotor and Bar, where they were redistributed inland. However, shortages of basic goods persisted, especially in resistance-controlled zones. The black market flourished, with merchants and smugglers moving goods through mountainous back routes, often paying both Italian garrisons and local insurgents for safe passage. This parallel economy undermined the puppet state's fiscal policies and further demonstrated its inability to control the flow of goods and resources. The Italians also expanded the use of locally recruited auxiliaries. These units, sometimes drawn from rival clans or politically opposed communities, were tasked with patrolling their home areas and reporting insurgent movements. While effective in providing local knowledge, such forces often became embroiled in personal or clan disputes, blurring the lines between counterinsurgency and local vendetta. This, in turn, generated additional cycles of reprisal, complicating Italian efforts to present themselves as impartial guarantors of order. By mid-1942, the pattern of conflict in Montenegro had settled into a rhythm of low-intensity but continuous warfare. Italian troops conducted periodic sweep operations, often pushing insurgents into more remote areas, but rarely destroying their capacity to return. The partisans maintained active resistance in the mountains, seeking to expand political influence, while the Chetniks entrenched themselves in regional strongholds. The puppet state continued to operate as a nominal government, its authority extending only as far as the range of Italian weapons could enforce it. Although large-scale rebellion like that of July 1941 had not yet reoccurred, the underlying conditions that had fueled it, foreign occupation, political division, and economic hardship, remained unresolved, setting the stage for further instability. By late 1942, Montenegro's political and military landscape was defined by a three-way struggle: Italian occupation forces, the communist-led partisans, and the royalist Chetniks. While the puppet government in Cetinje still existed on paper, its influence was marginal, confined to ceremonial functions and minor administrative tasks under close Italian supervision. Real authority in the territory was exercised by the Italian military command, which continued to view Montenegro as a strategically important buffer between the Adriatic coast and the contested interior of the Balkans. Italian strategy during this period increasingly relied on controlling key communication routes rather than attempting to pacify every district. The mountainous interior, with its scattered settlements and limited road network, was deemed too costly to hold permanently. Instead, the Italians fortified a network of garrisons along major transport corridors: Podgorica to Nikšić, Cetinje to Kotor, and the coastal route from Bar toward the Albanian border. These garrisons were supplied regularly by convoy and supported by mobile units capable of rapid deployment against insurgent activity. The partisans, benefiting from growing coordination with the wider Yugoslav movement, escalated their operations. Units in Montenegro conducted raids on Italian supply depots, attacked isolated outposts, and sabotaged bridges. They also sought to expand political control through the establishment of liberated zones in remote areas, where they organized local assemblies, distributed propaganda, and implemented rudimentary governance in line with partisan ideology. These zones served both as logistical bases and as symbols of an alternative authority to the occupation. The Chetniks, meanwhile, had shifted their focus toward consolidating territorial control in the eastern and northern regions. They maintained armed forces capable of resisting both Italians and partisans when necessary, but their overall posture toward the occupation remained pragmatic. In some sectors, Chetnik commanders entered into tacit arrangements with Italian officers, avoiding confrontation in exchange for supplies or freedom of movement. These arrangements were never uniform across Montenegro, and sometimes broke down under local pressures, but they reflected a mutual interest in limiting the partisans' influence. The Italians exploited the rivalry between the two resistance movements. Intelligence operations sought to feed mistrust, leaking information about supposed betrayals and encouraging each side to view the other as a greater threat than the occupation itself. This policy reduced the likelihood of a united front against Italian control, though it also meant that occupation forces often found themselves managing multiple, unpredictable fronts. Economically, the occupation faced mounting difficulties. Supply lines from Italy were strained by the broader demands of the Mediterranean War, especially after Allied advances in North Africa threatened Axis shipping. Shortages of fuel, ammunition, and basic provisions in Montenegro forced the Italians to prioritize military needs over civilian welfare. Rationing intensified, and the puppet government had little capacity to alleviate the impact on the population. In rural areas, barter and smuggling became essential to survival, with goods moving through clandestine routes that neither the Italians nor the puppet authorities could fully control. Propaganda remained a key tool for the Italians and their collaborators. State newspapers and radio broadcasts emphasized themes of order, stability, and cultural connection between Italy and Montenegro. Public events commemorating historical anniversaries were staged with Italian and Montenegrin flags displayed side by side. Yet attendance was often sparse, and reports from local administrators noted that these efforts did little to shift popular attitudes in favor of the regime. Militarily, the end of 1942 saw an uptick in partisan operations, as Axis forces across the Balkans faced increasing pressure. The Italians responded with a series of coordinated sweeps, often involving thousands of troops supported by artillery and air reconnaissance. These operations temporarily disrupted insurgent activity, but rarely eliminated it. Partisan units simply withdrew deeper into the mountains and re-emerged once the main Italian forces had moved on. Chetnik forces also engaged in selective offensives against partisan-held villages, further fragmenting the resistance landscape. By the close of the year, Italian control over Montenegro remained intact in the coastal and lowland areas, but tenuous in the highlands. The puppet state functioned as a political facade, unable to implement policies independently or extend authority into contested zones. The Italians recognized that their hold on the territory relied less on the formal institutions they had created, and more on a sustained, resource-intensive military presence. This reality foreshadowed the difficulties they would face in 1943, when shifts in the broader war would begin to erode the foundations of their occupation. The year 1943 opened with signs that the strategic situation in Montenegro and across the Balkans was entering a decisive phase. The Axis powers faced mounting pressure on multiple fronts. In North Africa, the Italian and German retreat toward Tunisia was underway, threatening Axis control of Mediterranean supply lines. In the Soviet Union, the Red Army's winter offensives after Stalingrad were reshaping the Eastern Front. And in the Balkans, Allied support for resistance forces was growing. These developments directly affected Italian capacity to maintain a costly occupation in Montenegro. Italian command in Cetinje and Podgorica received orders from Rome to conserve resources, hold key positions, and avoid becoming overextended in the interior. This meant consolidating garrisons along essential routes and withdrawing from some outlying posts that were difficult to supply or defend. While this improved security for core areas, it created opportunities for the partisans to expand influence in the vacated zones. By spring, several mountain districts in northern and central Montenegro operated under de facto partisan administration, with improvised courts, local councils, and supply depots. Partisan forces, increasingly well-armed, thanks to captured Italian weapons and limited Allied airdrops, intensified their operations. Their strategy combined military actions with political organization, aiming to integrate Montenegro fully into the broader Yugoslav liberation movement. Partisan commanders emphasized discipline in dealings with civilians, seeking to contrast their governance with the perceived corruption and inefficiency of the puppet regime. Propaganda leaflets and clandestine radio broadcasts urged villagers to withhold support from both the Italians and the Chetniks. The Chetniks, under leaders such as Pavle Jurisic, maintained substantial forces in certain regions, particularly in the east. Their approach remained ambivalent toward the Italians. While engaging in occasional skirmishes, they often refrained from direct confrontation, prioritizing the fight against the partisans. In some cases, Chetnik units accepted Italian arms and supplies to bolster their campaigns against communist forces. These arrangements, though tactically advantageous for both sides in the short term, deepened divisions within the resistance and reinforced the fragmentation of anti-Axis activity in Montenegro. The puppet government continued to function nominally, but had little relevance in the unfolding conflict. Ministers issued decrees, organized cultural events, and made public appeals for unity. Yet these actions had minimal impact beyond the coastal towns and administrative centers under firm Italian control. Even in these areas, Italian officers, not local officials, held the decisive authority in matters of security, resource allocation, and transportation. Economically, the strain of prolonged occupation and disrupted trade worsened living conditions. The collapse of regular maritime supply from Italy, partly due to Allied naval operations in the Adriatic, led to chronic shortages of fuel, manufactured goods, and even basic foodstuffs in urban areas. Inflation eroded the value of the Montenegrin currency, and barter became the dominant means of exchange in rural markets. Smuggling networks expanded, often operating with the tacit acceptance of local garrisons in exchange for bribes or a share of goods. The summer of 1943 brought new instability as Allied bombing raids on Italian infrastructure in the Adriatic and Balkans disrupted supply lines further. Morale among Italian troops in Montenegro began to decline, with reports of desertions and increasing reliance on local auxiliaries for patrol duties. The Italian High Command, aware of the shifting balance in the war, issued contingency plans for the defense or evacuation of key coastal positions should the Allies attempt a landing in the eastern Adriatic. The turning point came in September 1943, when Italy signed an armistice with the Allies. News of the surrender reached Montenegro rapidly, throwing Italian garrisons into disarray. In some locations, units attempted to negotiate safe passage out of the territory. In others, they surrendered weapons to whichever local force, partisan or Chetnik, was nearest. The collapse of Italian authority created a sudden power vacuum. The partisans moved quickly to seize major towns, collect abandoned equipment, and establish control over administrative functions. In many areas, they succeeded before the Germans could intervene. However, the German military responded with speed, launching Operation Achse to occupy former Italian-held territories throughout the Balkans. By late September, German units, including elements of the 118th Jager Division and the 369th Infantry Division, Croatian, had entered Montenegro, taking over key coastal ports, road junctions, and garrison towns. The Germans rearmed certain Chetnik detachments for use against the partisans, while also installing their own military administration in place of the ineffective puppet regime. For the independent state of Montenegro, this marked the effective end of its existence. From this point forward, Montenegro would be under direct German occupation, with the former Italian-sponsored government reduced to a symbolic role, if it functioned at all. The German takeover in September 1943 transformed the political and military environment in Montenegro. The rapid replacement of Italian forces with German units brought a stricter occupation regime and a more direct approach to counterinsurgency. The Wehrmacht and SS forces established their headquarters in Podgorica, while coastal areas were placed under tight military control to secure maritime supply lines and prevent potential Allied landings. The Germans retained certain elements of the former Italian administrative structure, but subordinated them entirely to their own command, stripping the puppet government of any remaining autonomy. For practical purposes, the independent state of Montenegro ceased to operate as a functioning political entity. The Germans pursued a dual strategy. Militarily, they deployed experienced mountain and light infantry units to secure strategic towns, road junctions, and passes, while conducting large-scale sweeps into the interior to disrupt partisan networks. Politically, they sought to co-opt local forces, primarily Chetnik detachments, by offering them weapons, supplies, and limited autonomy in return for active participation in operations against the communist-led resistance. This arrangement reflected German priorities. Eliminating or neutralizing partisan forces was considered essential to maintaining control over the region and safeguarding the overland route between the Adriatic and the interior of the Balkans. For the partisans, the German occupation presented both a challenge and an opportunity. The loss of Italian forces, who in many cases had been less aggressive and more fragmented in their approach, was offset by the sudden influx of abandoned Italian weaponry after the armistice. Throughout September and October 1943, partisan units rapidly absorbed this equipment, expanding their firepower and organizational capacity. The Yugoslav Partisan High Command prioritized Montenegro as part of its broader strategic plan, dispatching experienced cadres from other regions to strengthen local leadership and integrate operations into a coordinated national effort. The Chetniks, for their part, faced a critical choice. Many commanders deepened their collaboration with the Germans, reasoning that the communist victory posed a greater long-term threat to their political goals than continued Axis occupation. In return, German authorities allowed them to maintain control over certain districts, especially in eastern and northern Montenegro, so long as they engaged the partisans and refrained from challenging German military priorities. This alliance, however, was tactical rather than ideological, and tensions persisted over resources, command authority, and civilian reprisals. German counterinsurgency operations were marked by harsher reprisals than those of the Italians. Villages suspected of aiding the partisans were subject to mass arrests, executions, and the destruction of property. Civilians were deported to labor or concentration camps in occupied Yugoslavia, Germany, or territories under the control of the independent state of Croatia. These measures aimed to sever the logistical and moral support base of the resistance, but often had the opposite effect, driving more recruits to join the partisan movement. By the winter of 1943-1944, German field reports acknowledged that despite intensive operations, the insurgency remained active and in some areas had expanded. The remnants of the puppet government lingered as a nominal entity, used primarily for propaganda purposes. Official communiques and ceremonial appearances attempted to present continuity of Montenegrin independence, but these gestures carried little weight in practice. The real power lay entirely with the German military and their local allies. Internationally, the fiction of a sovereign Montenegrin state had already dissolved. Diplomatic recognition had never extended beyond Axis partners, and with Italy's surrender, even that limited acknowledgement became meaningless. Through 1944, the balance of power continued to shift. Allied support to the partisans increased, including supplies delivered by air and occasional commando missions landed on the Adriatic coast. The partisans launched coordinated offensives, gradually reclaiming territory from German and Chetnik control. By late 1944, with the Red Army advancing through the Balkans and the collapse of German positions in neighboring Serbia, Montenegro became increasingly untenable for the Wehrmacht. German forces began a staged withdrawal toward Bosnia and Croatia, destroying infrastructure in their path to slow the Allied advance. The collapse of German control in late 1944 effectively ended the occupation phase in Montenegro. The partisans, now the dominant military and political force, quickly moved to integrate the region into the emerging federal structure of post-war Yugoslavia. The wartime divisions between communists and royalists, between collaborators and resistors, left deep political and social scars. The Independent State of Montenegro, conceived in 1941 as a nominally sovereign entity under Italian patronage, had lasted barely 2 years in any operational sense and had never achieved legitimacy among the majority of the population. Its creation, suppression, and eventual disappearance became a case study in the limits of Axis political engineering in the Balkans. In the post-war period, the brief history of the puppet state was largely interpreted through the lens of the victorious partisan narrative, which portrayed it as a failed occupation tool rejected by the Montenegrin people. Yet archival evidence from all sides reveals a more complex picture, a fragile construct caught between foreign strategic ambitions, local political rivalries, and the realities of a protracted guerrilla war. Its legacy remained part of Montenegro's contested wartime memory, a reminder of the turbulent interplay between collaboration, resistance, and survival in the Second World War Balkans.